I'm Jane Evans, and I'm a life change coach, a speaker, a trainer, and an author. And I want to bring to this discussion on safety in communities and the levels of violence that many are experiencing, the need to think about the role of early childhood trauma, attachment needs, and that loss of any sense of internal safety. I can remember years ago when I was working in Bristol, one of the young people telling me that he had never really felt safe anywhere. So he'd grown up living with domestic violence. He lived in a community where all forms of violence were very common. And then when he would go to school, he'd often get into problems there and end up being sent somewhere, exclusion or excluded for the day or whatever. So he didn't feel that people there had his backs either. Plus he had to negotiate and navigate some of his peers who were at school who he also didn't feel safe around. So that was a real wake-up call for me, and I began thinking about this whole thing about when we don't create internal safety. Of course, what we're doing is putting a child and a young person in a constant state of survival. And when we're in a constant state of survival, we're either in fight, flight, freeze, or flop. So flop is complete shutdown. And I've got a couple of slides that I just wanted to share with you, just to add a bit more to what I'm saying today. And the reason for this is because, it just helps us think about this in a different way. If we keep thinking about, of course, I can't now see. Let me get my glasses. So we keep thinking about this as a mindset problem, that, we have to change mindsets, that we have to build in resilience in communities. Well, yes, we have to build in access to resilience, but it's not so much a change of mindset. It really is about creating internal safety. So I love this definition of trauma because people tend again to focus on the event, the stabbing, the attack, the whatever it was, as, oh, that was traumatic. Well, of course it was. But what we know from research and science is that children overcome or live fairly well beyond one-off events of trauma if they have a really solid foundation at home and they have really strong relationships at home. But in reality, many of the communities that we have nowadays, the parents of the children and young people who are being attacked and feeling the need to leave home with knives on them and some other forms of safety, these are the children of parents who have never felt safe themselves on the inside. So trauma is something that we store within us, in our body, in our brain systems. It's going to stay in there until we find ways to process, release, and be rid of it to a certain extent. And that isn't necessarily by talking about it. So trauma is locked inside of people, and therefore the sense of safety is not going to be present. And when we don't feel safe, then we're in constant survival mode. When we're in survival mode, we're not able to thrive. We're in a state of waiting for the worst things to happen. And certainly, that has been my experience for many, many years, is working with people who just, life seems to be a series of catastrophes, dramas, traumas, because that's actually how it's been, and that's what it feels like anyway. So let's think a little bit about the pre-birth element of this, and how and why, therefore, we need to really, really invest in our early years settings, our early years professionals, and in parents before they become parents, and also when they are first, particularly when they're first parents, because that's where so much of this can really be reduced for this generation and generations to come. So we know that the survival brain, which is where the trauma is going to be living, and the emotional brain, which is where the emotional memories of trauma and fear and threat and isolation are going to also be very present, are primitive areas of the brain. And for me, the survival brain is like a little meerkat, because, you know, if you go around communities where there's a lot of fear, and then you look at people, which I often do when I arrive in places where I'm going to be doing some work, and you'll often see people and they'll be very upright and they'll be moving very fast, and it's all very rigid and, you know, sort of darting from place to place. And of course, that makes sense in many places. And what you'll also find is that there will be a lot of common shared illnesses. So there'll be lots of high anxiety, there'll be lots of people experiencing physical illnesses as well, very similar, a lot of back problems, joint problems, skin problems, breathing problems. These are how high anxiety and trauma show up. So honestly, when I arrive sometimes to speak in communities, I will go and walk around the streets that are just near to where I'm staying, and I'll just look at people. And what I see is a lot of people who look like meerkats. So the survival brain starts developing in the womb, which is why preparing parents to reduce their anxiety and feel safer themselves already is going to improve outcomes for children. Then the middle part of the brain, which for me is like a little elephant, because it's where we store our memories and particularly the emotions attached to memories. So again, if you have a child who is developing in the womb of a woman who's never ever felt safe in her life, and her partner, same thing, then the child is born and the parents are doing absolutely the best they can, but they're in a state of high alert a lot of the time, or complete overwhelm, which is a very low mood, low interaction, then we're creating a similar environment for that child to now develop in and their brain to grow in to the ones that the parents grew up in. And so we're not really addressing things at this core level. Then the intelligent brain, this is really where the most hope lies, is not going to fully form for our young people until they are mid-20s for girls and nearly 30s for boys or men. So this means that we actually have many, many opportunities to really turn things around, but we have to get in with the right stuff. So essentially, the meerkat brain, the survival brain, is your fight, flight, freeze brain. It's the act and react brain. It's not intelligent, but it is where we mostly live when we're frightened. The middle brain is the relational, emotional brain. And again, it's a primitive part of the brain. It doesn't really respond to being taught at that well, and it will work very closely with the survival brain. But we can see that, you know, addressing, unpacking, and helping children be able to recognize and name their feelings is a massive part of, again, reducing the fear and creating internal safety. And then the intelligent brain for me is the clever monkey. Monkeys are super, super clever, and they're often very good at relationships and, you know, things that sometimes we probably need to learn from. So what are the three hidden things when there's trauma? Well, what are children experiencing when they're young? They are often experiencing, because they live with adults who are absolutely doing their best, but themselves constantly and consistently in a state of emotional and sometimes physical overwhelm just with the daily grind of life, plus their own trauma. So the children with their very underdeveloped brains and their high emotional needs are constantly in a state of physical and emotional overwhelm, which creates a survival, rather than letting them have access to thriving. And when you're a child, you can't escape. You cannot escape your own environment. You can't escape the adults who are there, whether they are kind and compassionate at times, and then because of their own fear, maybe erratic, angry, upset, and withdrawn. And, you know, for a child, then there's this sense of ongoing, inescapable stress, which leads to an internalized sense of complete hopelessness. And, you know, if you think about what we're seeing in communities, this is it. You know, young people who are not able to function and cope because they're in this state of high anxiety, complete overwhelm. And so a leaf falling off a tree is going to feel like an immense level of threat and danger to them. So living in a state of survival, then what's going to happen is being flicked automatically a lot of the time into fight, flight, flee, freeze, or flop. And you know, we don't have any say in this because this comes from our survival brain, and it's, you know, it manifests itself in people either getting into this state of lashing out or trying maybe to escape from it. And when there isn't that option, then there's the freeze and the flop. Now, these are really, really uncomfortable states to live in permanently, and they're not what nature intended. Nature intended for us very occasionally to have to survive a difficult situation. If that's the backdrop of your life 24/7, then it's impossible to live that way without finding some way of relief and relaxation. Now, when we have access to calm, loving, holding relationships, that can bring some opportunities for us to enjoy life, to access better health, because we feel connected to other human beings, which is exactly what nature intended. We can improve the quality of our sleep, and we get to live a life where we are calm enough to actually feel present in the moment, which is what many of us still strive to feel like. But when you're in a community where maybe in your own home you haven't felt safe, outside the home doesn't feel safe, school doesn't feel safe, traveling to and from school doesn't feel safe, and of course now we also have lack of safety online, then you can see that for young people, spending your life being flicked between fight, flight, freeze, flop is intolerable, and it's going to mean that you just it's almost impossible to trust anyone, and least of all yourself. So it makes sense to go out ready for anything, ready for danger. And we have to go in at this level. We have to educate the leaders in our community about what trauma is, how it shows up, explore with them what resources lie within communities, because there are always great resources, and that's the people. And also educate children right from tiny all the way through. One of the real breakthroughs I always had when I was working with young people was when I could explain the brain to them, which is where the meerkat, elephant, monkey brain came from. Because then I could give them insight into them having this very reactive, very terrified survival meerkat brain, and then look at ways to help calm this brain. And that just made sense to them, because they would all tell me, no, I've never felt safe in my life. So it's really important that whoever's going in to do this direct work in the communities is very, very aware of their own trauma and their energy that they take near vulnerable children, young people, parents, and carers. Because we're all energy to energy beings. You know, you think of animals like you can see in the slide. If there's a gang of meerkats, a herd of deer, and one pops up, then they all pop up, and they don't discuss, I think maybe there might be a lion over there. No, because the same as us, they're wired to fight, flight, freeze, flop. And these are all known strategies that are just built into all of us. Humans are the same. So when we are going in to work with people, we need to be very, very aware of how grounded we are, how regulated our trauma is, and so that we don't go in and trigger people more just purely by our own physical presence. That said, the best opportunity is to build into communities safe relational experiences, so that children and young people learn how to judge when is it safe to approach somebody, what does safety even feel like in another human being, and when to avoid, but to do it in a way that isn't going to maybe trigger or antagonize somebody who may be very, very frightened. Now, for me, these are the core things that we need to be sharing, and teaching, and make sure if we are the professionals going into communities that we really, really know how to take ourselves in as emotional, physically safe presence, and to be able to understand when we have been triggered by someone else's trauma so that we don't get pulled into it or make it worse. So there are amazing projects going on. There's incredible work going on. I just hope that we can make it very, very trauma educated so that we share this in the communities and we give them ownership of what trauma really is, how it plays out, and most importantly, what it needs. And really nowadays, what the research is showing us is it's not sitting down and talking and trying to change mindsets. First of all, we have to create a sense of safety in the whole human being, and that starts with the body. And that has to be done very, very carefully and in a very informed way. And then talking and communicating, yes, that can happen later. So I hope that's been really useful to you. And, you know, let's just keep this discussion going, because it's vital for our young people, as we all know. And it's an exciting time in terms of we have got immense levels of research and findings and things that we know really, really do make a difference. We just have to get past the let's all sit down and talk about this, because that isn't the thing that makes the most difference.